And next up, we have financials, 7.01. May I have a motion to approve a resolution to Governor DeWine in the Ohio General Assembly regarding school funding priorities?
So moved.
Second.
Would you like to talk to us about this?
Would you like me to read the resolution?
That would be great,
Okay.
yeah.
So resolution of the City of Westerville City School District Board of Education to Governor Mike DeWine and the Ohio General Assembly regarding school funding priorities. Whereas the Ohio Constitution guarantees a thorough and efficient set of common schools for all students, ensuring equitable and adequate funding for public education. And whereas the current state funding formula for public education is using costs from 2022 and does not fully account for inflationary increases in the cost of education, including teacher salaries, operational expenses, transportation, and instructional materials. And whereas cost studies for special education have identified the need for increased funding to support students with disabilities, yet the state has not fully implemented these studies into its funding model. And whereas the instability of the state share calculation creates unpredictability in school funding, making it difficult for districts to plan for long-term financial sustainability. And whereas the state's failure to fully fund the school funding formula forces local school districts to rely more heavily on local property taxes, increasing the financial burden on homeowners. And whereas local property taxes already place an unsustainable burden on residents, and the state must take action to provide relief without further eroding public school funding. And whereas House Bill 920 restricts inflationary growth on voted levies, preventing districts from receiving increased revenue to meet rising costs and effectively shifting the tax burden between local taxpayers without substantially increasing revenues and creating school funding shortfalls. And whereas unfunded mandates imposed by the state legislature place additional financial burdens on school districts, requiring them to comply with new regulations and policies without providing the necessary resources to do so effectively. And therefore be it resolved that the Westerville City Schools Board of Education urges Governor DeWine and the Ohio General Assembly to prioritize public school funding by updating the cost inputs in the school funding formula to reflect inflationary increases each year, implementing the cost studies for special education adjusted for inflation to ensure adequate resources for students with disabilities, stabilizing the state share calculation to ensure predictable and equitable funding for school districts, fully funding the state school funding formula to reduce the over-reliance on local property taxes, avoiding the imposition of additional mandates on school districts without providing dedicated funding to support their implementation, and be it further resolved that the Westerville City Schools Board of Education calls upon state policymakers to address the unintended consequences of House Bill 920, which limits school districts' ability to keep pace with rising costs and shifts the burden of school funding between local taxpayers. And be it finally resolved that a copy of this resolution be sent to Governor DeWine, members of the Ohio General Assembly, the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, and other relevant stakeholders to advocate for necessary reforms in school funding to ensure the continued success of Ohio's public school students.
I just have one, I know that I've asked you about this, so I'm hoping that you can explain it for everyone. Could you talk a little bit about how we could stabilize the state share calculation?
Yes, I can. So the state share calculation, as I've mentioned, the state is updating it for inflationary costs based on the local wealth factor. So it's our local property values and our resident income. Right now, they're looking at a 3-year average, but they're updating that year over year, that 3-year average, while they're keeping those cost inputs at the same level. And so what they could do is keep our state share. If they're not going to update the cost inputs, they should stop updating our inflationary increases in the local wealth factor. That would be my ask to the state.
Thank you. The only other thing that I would ask, if my colleagues would be, well, I guess I'll wait and ask that. Sure. But is there any other questions? Okay, then maybe we can take the vote.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Lebian?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes.